I opened my mouth, and the room closed itself around the sound. It was Thanksgiving, and the air in Claire's dining room felt like a stage set. Too bright, too curated, heavy with the scent of roasted turkey and orange zest. My cousins laughed at something someone else said. My uncle clapped his hands like a man who measured applause. We all sat around the table like actors assigned our roles, grateful, amused, relieved to be distracted. Evan, who had come because he never missed one of our family dinners since he'd retired 2 streets over, rested his napkin, looked at me, and then leaned forward. His hand slid a folder across the table. The dull thud of paper in the hush was louder than the turkey being carved. People shifted. Claire's smile, a practiced lift at the corner of her mouth, stiffened. "Jonah," Evan said, voice soft but steady, "who did you expect to get the deed?" The room fell into that kind of silence that felt physical, like someone had closed a door you couldn't open. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the oven light ticking off like a clock. Claire's mouth moved first. "Evan, you shouldn't." Her face was a porcelain mask. The napkin trembled in her hands, which was absurd. Claire never trembled. I didn't answer. My throat had gone dry. I watched my sister through the blur of everyone else. She had seamed her life together so well. Each photo, each charity event, like stitches in a flawless hem. Reality was more ragged. I felt the heat of my cheeks and the cool of the folder under my fingers. I knew what was inside. I had spent 2 weeks chasing small, dissonant threads that didn't make sense. Tonight was the end of that chase. Evan did something I would later replay 1,000 times in my head. He slid a printout across to Claire and left a second copy in front of me. On the top line, in a font Claire loathed because it belonged to the government, was the language that severed the pretense. Delivery confirmed, signature matched. Claire's knuckles whitened. For the first time in my life, I saw a break in her practiced composure. The room tilted, as if the ceiling were higher than it had been 5 seconds earlier. People glanced from Evan to me, and for the first time, the family looked at me the way I had always wanted them to, fully, without a filter. Then every eye in the room landed on my sister. She laughed, a high, thin thing, and said, "What is this nonsense? Who printed that?" Evan didn't answer. I inhaled, and the smell of lemon and rosemary filled my chest. It steadied me. I had rehearsed 7 different endings to this night in my head, none of them as quiet and electric as this opening. The deceptions had been patient. So was I. Everything I was about to say, or had let Evan say, came down to the single, small detail that Claire thought she could control: the mail. The very instrument most people considered mundane had been her weapon. And then I told them what I had found. 2 weeks earlier, nothing in my life had screamed evidence. My days were a loop: code, coffee, patch a neighbor's leaking sink, invoice for a late client. At night, I slept to a playlist of rain sounds and distant buses. My mother had died 2 years before. She was the quiet kind, who wrote me letters and left recipes. When she passed, the house, our old brownstone, became the center of every small, careful argument that followed. In her will, an allocation had been made. The house's remaining deed, and part of the trust she'd saved, were for Jonah's care until I found my footing. The language was simple because she hated legalese. The idea was this: she wanted me to have a place to build from. But months after the will was executed, Claire's name had started to appear in places I couldn't reconcile with caretaker. She announced she'd be managing the sale and trust disbursement, as if management were a synonym for dispossession. She moved documents, kept things safe, and filtered any family questions through a steady, editorial voice, calm, practical, slightly paternalistic. I had always assumed she loved on Mother too, in her own way. Love can be messy. But I also had receipts, metaphorical ones at first, invitations that didn't reach me, events I was forgetting, texts that vanished as if they'd been swallowed whole. Then came the small, clinical anomalies. A package containing a legal document that never made it to my door, a notice that said delivery attempted when I had been home, an odd reply to an email from a bank that used an IP address traced to Claire's house. Claire could call it help. She could call it keeping the family in order. To me, the pattern looked like intentional erasure. People erase you by removing your witness. They intercept your mail, reframe your narrative, and then justify it under the language of care. I had never wanted a fight. I'd let things go to keep the peace. But peace at the cost of your name, your legal right, and your dignity was not peace at all. It was an arrangement that turned you into something decorative, present when convenient, absent when liabilities arose. I remembered one text in particular. A week before I started digging, I'd sent Claire a message. Did the deed go through? She'd replied almost instantly. We'll handle it. You're too stressed. Rest. Her emote, the smiling face. But we'll handle it had an edge to it that hadn't existed before. It was the voice of someone who intended to hold control, not steward it. So I went looking, quietly. At first, my investigation was clumsy. Coffee-fueled spreadsheets and long, awkward questions to people I barely spoke to. But I was in a trade that rewarded curiosity. I knew how to follow timestamps and trace IPs. I knew how a small inconsistency could expand into a story that no one could comfortably ignore. Step 1. The mail. Evan had taught me to take notes. He was meticulous. He kept a notepad of oddities since retirement. He'd seen how mail could be rerouted by those with access, and knew the postal world had rules that could be tested. We met on a Wednesday in his kitchen. He pulled a small drawer open and produced a stack of old postal notices, like an archivist reaching for a secret. Ask for the delivery logs, he said. If Claire intercepted anything, we'll see it in the chain. Postal tracking shows the route, and the signatures don't lie. Evan's hands moved like the hands of a man who had once opened hundreds of cases, like a slow surgeon. And don't tell anyone yet. I called the postal office like a man who had only ever used it to mail birthday cards. I pretended I was checking on a neighbor's package. The person on the line was helpful and weary, the kind of voice that made it easier to be polite. I filled out a form requesting a delivery confirmation copy, and to my surprise, they sent it. It was a small PDF with a tracking number and a scanned signature. I compared it to the digital signature on the online file. The signature on the scan matched Claire's usual scrawl in family emails. But signatures can be forged, I told myself, so I dug deeper. Next came the email logs. Because I did freelance web work, I knew someone at a bank might have been sloppy with a header, and that header could reveal an IP address. I accessed old emails my mother had sent me. She'd emailed me a scan of the original will early on, and checked the thread. There was a forwarded confirmation email that had been intercepted and re-forwarded by the same address Claire used for family management. The timestamps were off. The source header on a forwarded message contained an IP that traced back to Claire's house. It wasn't one smoking gun. It was a string of small, precise bullets. A delivery confirmed here. A forwarded email with an origin trace there. A neighbor who remembered a package Claire had accepted for safekeeping on days I'd stood in the apartment waiting. I used public records to check property-related filings. Claire's name had popped up in a deed transfer form, signed the same week as the trust payout. The dollar amounts were right. The dates matched the pattern I'd suspected. And then there was the group chat erasure. The first time I noticed it, I thought my phone had a glitch. The family group chat, where holidays were planned, where my mother's recipes were shared, had fewer messages than I remembered. Old threads that had once held my mother's voice were gone. And so were several "You OK" messages from cousins. A few months later, my features on the group had changed. I was no longer listed as an admin. Claire claimed she had streamlined the chat to reduce chaos. She had removed a handful of names without notice and explained it as efficiency. Erasure like that is surgical, not loud like a blow-up, but absolute. People remove your presence from the record and then claim the evidence never existed when you ask about it. I compiled everything into a folder: screenshots, postal tracking logs, the IP traces, the forwarded emails with origin headers, a neighbor's sworn note about a package that came in while I was home, and a copy of the deed transaction. Each piece by itself could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern. It was not screaming. It was a cold, clear argument that held up to scrutiny. I remember the night I printed everything. Late, the lamp on, the printer spitting out pages like a small, patient machine. I stacked the sheets. I slid them into a folder, the way you tuck a child into bed, methodical and gentle. I felt anger, but it was a focused, practical anger. It wasn't the hot, messy kind that gets you into trouble. This anger wanted one thing: truth confirmed. Evan helped me finalize the plan. He instructed me to copy the relevant post office confirmations and to have them notarized. He suggested I ask for a certified statement from the postal office, something official, public. I did. While I waited for the official copies, I kept my mouth shut. Claire had the power of narrative, and she would use it. Public humiliation would not be the point of this. I wanted validation and restoration, not a spectacle. The more I collected, the more I realized why Claire had been so careful. The easiest abuses are those no one notices. If you control communications, you control context. You can choose which letters reach whose desk, what birthdays are acknowledged, who hears about what. It's a slow, bureaucratic gaslighting. People think they're chaotic or forgetful. You become the reliable hand that keeps things calm. Meanwhile, you have rewritten the ledger. I began to feel something I had not felt for a long time: agency. Back at the Thanksgiving table, Evan's voice had the gravity of someone delivering a verdict. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He slid the notarized copy forward, the same one the postal inspector had signed off on. It was dry and official, an objective thing in a room full of subjective performance. "Delivery confirmed," he said. "Signature on file matches Claire Eaton. Mail was accepted at her address and logged as received on October 14th. The bank emailed confirmation of the transfer on October 13th. That message was forwarded by the same Claire Eaton email account that has been administratively controlling the family's correspondence. Do you want to explain that?" It was the kind of clarity that required an answer. Claire opened her mouth and her voice shook on the first word, like a violin string struck too hard. "Jonah, you don't understand. She would have wanted me to. I just—" "You intercepted it," I said. My voice was low and leveled. I had not planned to be so calm, but calmness was a superpower in a room designed for chaos. "You accepted postal delivery in your name. You filed papers in your name. You replaced emails. You removed me from the family record. You told me to trust you." She flinched at my words, but then, predictably, turned to the script she'd used 100 times. "I did it to protect you. You were struggling. You're not ready. I'm your sister. I just handled it." Handled it. The word tasted like dust. "This isn't protection," Evan said. "This is possession, and it's theft of another name's agency." Around the table, faces moved from confusion to the slow horror of recognition. My aunt's hands went to her mouth. My cousin's jaw tightened like a door shutting. People were trying to reconcile the picture frames on the mantel with the ledger in front of them. A few of them had noticed things, had whispered about Claire taking charge, but had, like me initially, accepted the narrative of charity. That is the cruelty of small lies. They are plausible. Claire didn't cry. Her composure broke into bitter, precise sentences. "You think I wanted to?" She paused. "You think I wanted a fight?" She looked at me with something that was half accusation and half plea. "I thought I was doing what Mom would have wanted." "You didn't ask," I said. "You didn't show the documents. You signed papers behind my back. That's not asking. That's choosing for me." It was the first time in my life I used "I" like a tool and not a retreat. Saying it didn't explode the room, but it changed the temperature. It took the narrative from being about me as a problem to me as a person with rights. She tried to pivot, claimed clerical error, a misread email, the bank's poor communication, but the notarized prints and the postal chain didn't care for spin. The evidence was slow, precise, and bureaucratic, the kind of thing that didn't lend itself to dramatic proclamations, which was why it was perfect. It was undeniable. I felt the weight of our mother's empty chair across from us, how she had handed me a folded recipe and a note that said, "Promise me you'll keep Jonah close." The note was a whisper, an insistence. Claire had turned that insistence into a pretext for possession. The room registered it. Aunt Mara's hand found mine and squeezed. My grandmother, who had sat quiet as a stone for most of the dinner, met my eyes and nodded once, the shape of approval like a small, secret blessing. We didn't call the police that night. It was Thanksgiving, and there were people in the room who loved Claire as well as me. Instead, Evan turned to her and said what the folder in his hands already said. "You will return the deed and the funds. We will file an amended transfer and involve a lawyer if necessary. This will not be swept under the table." Claire looked at the folder and then at the faces around the table. Her carefully built house of public virtue had become fragile. For the first time, her public mask needed repair. She stood, hands in the front of her dress, and left the room to the murmurs of relatives. What came after was quieter than I expected. People called me later that week. My uncle apologized. He hadn't known the depth of what Claire had done. Cousins sent messages, some tentative, some full of, "I always thought something was off." Claire herself offered a bland mea culpa and an even blander promise to do better. The legal notice Evan helped me prepare, accompanied by copies of the postal confirmations and the forwarding headers, moved the story from family drama into official accountability. Claire returned the deed within 10 days and signed an affidavit acknowledging she had filed an error and that the retransfer would be made. She blamed stress and miscommunication. The lawyers were polite and professional. There was no dramatic courtroom battle. The truth had been gathered quietly and firmly, and that's what made it painful for her and restoring for me. When I finally held the deed in my hands, it felt like paper and more than paper. I stood in my 2-room apartment and considered the idea of a key, of a door that would be mine, not just by shape, but by name. I thought about all the times I'd let myself be shifted and shifted again for family ease. I had been taught peace as a kind of currency. What I had learned through the process was that peace withheld by others was not generosity, it was theft. Weeks later, I signed the transfer back into my name in a small room at the county office, while Evan waited in the lobby with his thermos. The woman at the counter explained the forms with a professional tenderness. When I walked out with the new document folded in my pocket like a lucky coin, the autumn light felt different, cleaner, as if the world had been subtly wiped. My phone rang. It was my grandmother. "You did right," she said, voice small but exact. "Your mother would be proud." The victory was not theatrical. It was a slow unspooling of justice that required patience more than fury. I didn't feel triumphant as you see in movies. I felt something quieter. Vindication wrapped in exhaustion and a gentle grief. grief for a sister who'd chosen control over trust, grief for the parts of the family that silence had cost. In the months that followed, I moved into the brownstone. I painted a small bedroom green and hung my mother's recipe card on the kitchen wall. I fixed squeaky steps, patched the plaster, and learned the names of pipes and boards. The house smelled like lemon oil and old books. I found old letters tucked into floorboards, a child's scrawl, the skeletal economy of our family's beginnings. I read them and felt the lineage of care weave back into me. Claire came by once. She stood in the doorway and didn't say much. We were both aware that some things were irreparable, and some things could be courted back into life with time and effort. I invited her for coffee, because I did not hate the idea of family healing. She declined. Time would tell. For now, I had made a small, decisive motion. I had reclaimed my mother's faith. If you've ever been quietly erased, removed from a family chat, a will, or the story someone told about you, know that the truth is a patient thing. It doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it is small, precise, and procedural. Postal logs, email headers, signatures. In a world of curated narratives, the evidence often lives in the archives. Finding it isn't glamorous, but it can be effective. True strength, in my experience, wasn't about unleashing fury. It was about knowing when to stop letting others do your living for you. It was about gathering what was yours, not in a spectacle, but in steady, legal steps, and refusing to accept erasure as care. If you've ever had to protect your peace by walking away, or by quietly collecting the proof you need, I want you to know you are not alone. The work of reclaiming your life is ordinary and brave at once. If this story resonates with you, share it in the comments. Tell me about a time you were erased and how you handled it, or what kept you from speaking up. And if you want more stories like this, calm, careful, and quietly victorious, subscribe. We'll keep telling the ones that matter.